So when I was in seminary, I had, I don't remember exactly what generation it was of iPhone. I don't know, early on. I think maybe the iPhone 4. Who's been on iPhone since iPhone 4? Yeah, okay. It was like really boxy. It was the first like really square one. And so they went from like a really rounded back to a really square kind of box, chunky little thing. And it was small. It was a lot smaller than our phones are today. I kind of want to go back to that. It's nice. It's small. It's like it doesn't capture as much attention from you. But here's the thing. That phone, the screen broke like all the time. I broke that screen, I think about 4 or 5 times I broke that screen. But listen, I was in school. I was in seminary. I was trying to pay for school. I was trying to work my way through that. I'm Dutch. And so I didn't go out and buy a new phone because I couldn't and I didn't want to. And like nothing inside of me said, hey, go and buy a new phone. Everything inside of me said, try to fix it. And so I went online, I bought this like cheap phone screen that you can buy on Amazon for it, and it wasn't made by Apple, I can tell you that right now. I don't know, like it came. I ordered it and it came, it showed up, and it was like $14 or something, like ridiculous. And I was like, I'm gonna fix this phone. How many of you have tried to fix a cell phone before? Computer? Yeah, right. The screws, okay. The screws, you cannot comprehend how tiny those screws are until you lose one in the carpet. So, what do you do? When you need to fix something, what do you do? What's like the number one, the first thing you do if you need to fix something? Okay, I'll tell you, the number one thing that I do is I YouTube it. I don't even Google it anymore. Forget it. I go straight to YouTube. I'm like, there has to be somebody out there who has thought about doing this before. And so I would watch YouTube videos, and I did. I was like, I'm going to replace this cell phone screen. I'm going to save myself a whole lot of money. And I watched hours of YouTube videos of people going through like overhead shot of taking apart the phone and labeling all the pieces, and then putting a new screen in and putting it all back together. And for them, it worked, and it was wonderful. And so I watched, and it was like hours. And finally, I just said to myself, I was like, man, just you got to do it. You're like, the phone's not working. Just try to fix it. The worst case scenario is the phone's still not working. Same, right? Just in the same boat. And so the first time I fixed my phone, it took like 3 hours, something like that, 3.5 hours. But I fixed it. And then I broke that one. So I did it again. I think by like the 4th iteration of screen, I had the replacement down to like 30 minutes. And I'd figured out, I was like, this screw doesn't matter, like I don't need that one here. And I started stripping the phone, and it still worked. I could replace the screen, kind of be on my way. That was a good generation of phones. So there's some things that you can only learn at the end of the day by doing them. Like no matter how much knowledge, no matter how much information, no matter how much time you spend like watching videos or watching other people do the thing that you need to do, there's no replacement for just doing it. For like taking the screen off and going, all right, I'm in it now, like here we go. Nothing can prepare you for that except for doing it. And there are probably many other places and cases where this is true. There's nothing that replaces just going after something and doing it. And the knowledge that you gain by doing it, neither failing miserably or succeeding by some fluke, like by some luck. Like there's nothing that can replace that. And I think we know this to be true. And we've seen it, like generation after generation has seen it. Benjamin Franklin said what? He said, tell me and I forget. I'm like, Benjamin Franklin, I'm right there with you, okay? Tell me and I will forget it, especially on Sunday. That's just like a special little information for you on Sunday. Like it's just like, whoop, gone. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember. And then he says, involve me and I'm gonna learn. Nietzsche said, the doer alone learneth. Or Aristotle, he says, the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. I love that. The things that we can only learn, that we have to learn before we can do them, we actually, in fact, can only finally learn it by doing it. Or Mark Twain, in a very Mark Twain way, a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something that he can learn in no other way. Done. Mark Twain and Aristotle. There are these moments in the Christian history and tradition and theology where someone has the absolute best intentions for something, for work that they've done or for writing that they've created. best intentions to offer care and support and encouragement, and they think about it. And then when they actually launch said thing or publish said writing, it goes so completely horribly sideways. You're like, how did I not see this coming? So I'll give you an example. John Calvin, right? Famous theologian, preacher, teacher of the Bible, pastor. He has a particular theology called predestination. Yep, who's heard of predestination? Hands up. Okay, who's heard of double predestination? That's like the oops, I didn't think about it part. So he intended this theology, this thing, to be so comforting for people. What he started to see is, hey, people are anxious. People are nervous. People are worried about their salvation. And they're questioning. They're like, am I really a believer? Like, am I really a follower of Jesus? Does Jesus really love me? Am I really saved? Am I really going to go to heaven? Like, all of these questions that kind of maybe rattle around in your minds. And what he started noticing is like, hey, my people are anxious. And as a pastor, he said, okay, so what is some of the theology that we could use here to help reinforce the strength of their faith? And so he said, hey, don't worry about it. This is not a John Calvin quote. This is a John Calvin, like the Message version. He said, hey, don't worry about it. If God chose you, then he chose you. You're locked in. It's okay. And so then what happened? People started thinking, well, maybe I wasn't chosen. Like, maybe he didn't choose me. Maybe this thing that Calvin meant for good and comfort, it just spiraled out of control. And people started using it and say, well, shoot, like Calvin, if you say God has chosen you, then what you're saying is maybe God hasn't chosen you. And so you put me right back at square one with my anxiety, because now I've got theology behind it saying, one of these things. In John 14, what we read, Jesus begins with very specific words. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And then he unfolds it. My Father's house has many rooms, and we read it. The entirety of the promise to prepare the disciples, to prepare Jesus' friends for the day when Jesus will no longer be there physically present with him, to bring them hope, to bring them comfort. In my Bible, the heading, at the beginning of this, that didn't exist, in the original manuscripts, but editors have added in just to help us navigate Scripture, right? It says, Jesus comforts his disciples. That's the title for this section. All of it was meant to bring comfort and security for them to know, like, hey, Jesus saying, like, coming close, like, I'm not going to be here for too much longer. And there are a few things you need to know so that you may have peace, so that you may be comforted, so that you would know when that happens, things are going to be okay. We're just under, for us, a week away from Good Friday. And on Good Friday, right, Christians around the world are going to gather, and they're going to remind themselves, as will we will remind ourselves, of the death of Jesus. And in the Gospel of John, the lines that we read that Jesus speaks in this chapter are 1 day removed from his arrest, from his trial, from his crucifixion, and from his death. So just to give it some context, like the Last Supper, that's already happened. So the Last Supper, you're like, okay, what happens after the Last Supper? It's the Last Supper. Jesus dies. Like, this conversation happens in between those moments. Jesus knows. It's like, for the disciples, listen, for all of us, like, death is very near. And so all of what he writes, all of what he says, all of what he speaks is intended to comfort his disciples ahead of that moment. Okay? And then Thomas responds. And I love Thomas. Thomas normally gets a bad rap, but we've talked about this. He gets a bad reputation. What is he called? Doubting Thomas. That's how he was remembered. Like, for the rest of eternity, dude was remembered to be one who doubted. And I've said this before. He's the one. He said, Jesus rose from the dead, and he's with his disciples. And Thomas is like, hey, I'm not going to believe it. Like, I'm not going to believe your word until I see the scars and the marks in his hands and on his side, and I actually touch them and feel like, okay, he's here. And I go, hey, great job, Thomas. Perfectly reasonable, completely acceptable questions to be asking. But again, like, Thomas here, in like a very Thomas way. He reminds Jesus, he's like, hey, actually, you can kind of picture him like maybe he's behind some of the disciples. And like the other ones are kind of like, okay, all right, like we're game, like we're listening to Jesus. Thomas is kind of like behind them. He's like, but actually, Jesus, like you haven't told us where you're going yet. You're saying all these things, but we don't know them. We don't know where you're going. We don't know the way to where you're leading us. How could we possibly know how to get there? When I was growing up, I worked at a camp, and got to preface this, some of my longest friendships have come out of my time at that camp. Loved it, loved a lot of it. But they had this kind of like saying that kind of governed their whole discipleship program, they called it. If, as a camp, you want a way to employ teenagers for like vastly lower than what you should be paying them, you just call it a discipleship program, and then you're good to go. But the whole sort of mantra of this discipleship program was this: knowing, being, doing. And if, as if to say, hey, we're going to teach you what you ought to know, and then if you know the right thing, you are going to become the right person, and then as you become the right person, you are going to do the right things. And that was the whole progression of it. To know would lead to being the person that you've kind of been created to be, or the person you ought to be, and then to do the things that you should be doing, as if knowledge would necessitate change. But again, I think we know that's not always how these things work. Here's Thomas. He says, we don't know. How can we go? So many of us are those disciples. We just kind of sitting there. We're like, well, if we knew the way, if we understood, we think maybe that Jesus is asking us to memorize more information, when what he's really asking us is to embrace life transformation. It's less about the knowledge that you can claim you have. Because I got to tell you that doesn't lead always to life transformation. I read my Bible almost every single day. And that's not to brag, because it's not in the way that I think all of us should be reading it. Like I read it to study, to know, to understand, to learn, because I teach and I preach. And that's a central part of what I do as a vocation. But I know that the study that I do of this book in preparation for preaching, though some of it is great, and some of it like I learn and I embrace and I grow because of it, it's not actually the time spent wrestling with Scripture and the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus in the way that is always, for me, going to lead to life transformation. That needs to happen on its own. For me as a follower of Jesus, apart from me as a pastor. Jesus is calling us into life transformation. Because here's Jesus who responds. He doesn't say, I told you the way. He doesn't say, I wrote it down on a map for you. He doesn't say, hey, here's a book. When I'm gone, read it and figure it out. He says, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Literally what Jesus is saying is, I am the road. When he says, I am the way, he says, I am the road. I am how you get from point A to point B. How many of you here watch The Office? Any Office fans? Hands up. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm not on my own here, okay? There's a scene in The Office where Michael and Dwight are driving a rental car, thank goodness, and the GPS tells Michael to make a right turn. Do you remember this? Do you remember this story, this episode, okay? So Michael stopped. He's like, I got to turn right. And Dwight's yelling at him, you can't turn right here. But he does. He cranks the wheel and he guns it right into a lake. And so he drives off the road, down into the, and luckily, like I said, it's a rental. I mean, maybe unluckily it's a rental car. I don't know. I'd rather total my own car in a lake than a rental car, probably. But he follows. The turn-by-turn instructions say, hey, turn here. He forgot that it was actually turn in 50 meters. the hard reality for us, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, and I think even if you're trying to like wrestle out, hey, like this thing called life is a little more difficult and a little more complicated than I ever expected or imagined, and you're trying to figure out, like, maybe it's because you're going through an exceptionally difficult season, or just a season of uncertainty, or maybe for some of you it's because, hey, you're growing up, and everybody all the time is asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? And you're just, can you just stop? Like, just let me be a kid. Let me be who I like. You're trying to figure out, like, what way to turn, or what way to go. The harsh, I think, reality of the Bible is that Jesus doesn't offer, like, there's no Christian GPS. Although that might sell pretty well. I don't know. The Bible isn't this user manual that troubleshoots every problem that you have, or that answers every single question that you could possibly imagine, or that has directions for you at every single turn, like you're at this intersection and there's only one way for you to go. Like, it's more complicated than that. It's more difficult than that. What Jesus offers, though, is this. I think he says, if you are trying to figure life out, if you are trying to get to God, if you're trying to understand who God is and who you've been created to be, or even just in some place, in some arena of that conversation, he says, listen, I am the way to figure that out. I'm the only way. He says, Jesus is the only way to understand, to know, to live out all of those things. He says, you're not going to stick enough information in your head so that you can know. You're invited into a relationship in which you grow. And it's in that relationship that Jesus pulls you. He says, hey, I'm going to reveal these things to you. You want to know who God is? I'm your best shot. You want to know the way to the Father? I'm the best that we have to offer. In Matthew 11, Jesus says it like this. I'm reading from the Message translation, which I do absolutely love. He says, no one knows the Son the way the Father does, nor the Father the way the Son does. But I'm not keeping it to myself. He says, I'm ready to go over it line by line with anyone willing to listen. All right, and then he says this, and I've read this section to you before. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take real rest. Here's what I want you to hear. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I'm not going to lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. He says, keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. He says, if you want to know, walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it. It's just saying, listen, like, hey, if you're running around trying to figure out who God is, who you are, where life leads, how to fit it all together, he says, come follow me. And you're going to learn as we go. You know, it's interesting to me that many people, most people, in fact, actually, statistically, have some level of faith or spirituality. Like, you know, we can't, it's just, I think for Christians, like, we often assume, hey, like, if you're not Christian, then maybe you follow some other religion. If you don't follow some other religion, then you're an atheist. And it's, like, very simple. It's just, like, cut and dry. And it's not, right? Most people have some level of faith. And I see it. I see it all the time. If you don't believe me, come to as many funerals as I get to go to. And you start to see it over and over and over again. It sounds like this. All roads lead up the same mountain. Maybe if you just do enough good. The only thing that can earn it is Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, I'm enough. I'm what earned what you're running around trying to find. I am the way to the Father. I am the way to life. He says, I'm the way to God. Let me reveal it in front of you. I'm the truth. Let me live it out in you. And I'm the life. Let me gift it to you. Stop trying to earn it. Thomas à Kempis writes this of Jesus. In Jesus' words, follow me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Without the way, there is no going. Without the truth, there is no knowing. Without the life, there is no living. I am the way which you must follow, and then the truth which you must believe, and then the life for which you get to hope for. That's the hope of Christianity. And Jesus offers it freely. Palm Sunday, many of the people who gathered and shouted, "Hosanna!" Right? You know, maybe you don't. You know how the story unfolds. Like, they greet Jesus as king. They proclaim him to be king. To offer palm branches, to lift palm branches, was a sign of respect to a king, to a general. To lay clothes down on the ground and to lay palm branches on the ground is to say, hey, don't let your foot touch that puddle of mud. Let me put what I have down for you. They acknowledge Jesus as king. And then on Good Friday, many of those same people, you got to wonder, you go, hey, you're in the crowd. The crowd cries, crucify him. Crucify him. Because they were expecting a conquering king, like a general who's going to come in and shake stuff up. Who we say Jesus is matters. He matters. And today the invitation is Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. The way to the Father. The way to understanding and the way to the life that you are given.